reprisal of their Turkish forces, who, and as I mentioned, the very vicious. So it's not a small number. This is a massive. And by September 8th, the Greek army evacuates their armies, leaves the population of Smyrna forces. September 9th, the Turkish nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal take the city. By Maria Ilio. Chaos broke out. Bishop or Metropolitan Chrysostomos is put into a difficult position. On Sunday, September 10th, he was invited, or so he thought, because the other religious figures, the rabbis and the Armenians, they had gone to see Mustafa Kemal. And he thought that he also should go to pay his respects to the new government. However, when he went, he was refused entry to see him, and as he was leaving, he was surrounded by a mob who grabbed him, beat him, spit on his face. They began stabbing him. They tore out his beard. They gouged his eyes. They cut his nose and ears off, and eventually dragged him through the streets and abandoned him in a corner, eventually dying on his own. There is an eyewitness, a French journalist who is present, and he sees this. And the person that is speaking to is Nureddin Pasha, one of the assistants to Mustafa Kemal. And so it's describing the scene when he had just been brought he had gone to inside, and now Nureddin Pasha gets on the balcony, and he speaks to the mob that's out there. And the source says, at the moment, Nureddin Pasha came on the balcony of the building and speaking to some 10 or 1,500 Muslims assembled in the square, declared that he was giving the Metropolitan unto them, and added, if he has done good to you, do good to him. If he has done harm to you, do harm to him. The mob took possession of Monsignor, or Chrysostomos, and carried him away. A little further on, in front of the shop of an Italian hairdresser named Ismail and an Italian protege, they stopped, and the Metropolitan was slipped into a white hairdresser's overall. They began to beat him with their fists and sticks and to spit on his face. They riddled him with stabs, they tore his beard off, they gouged his eyes out, they cut his nose and ears off. I'm sorry to be so grisly, but this is the eyewitness of what happened to a Metropolitan. So, in addition to what happened to the Metropolitan, Chrysostomos, the docks had become overcrowded. Any boat that could be brought close that would bring any possible refugees away would be overloaded. And here's an image of a boat being overturned by too many people clamoring to climbing on board. And so, in addition to that, on September 13, there's a fire that started. Some people say that there's a question of who started the fire at Smyrna. But in fact, there are American eyewitnesses that saw there were Turkish soldiers spreading gasoline in the Armenian district and lighting the fire. So in fact, there's clear evidence that this is actually started from Turkish soldiers. The Turkish position for a long time was that they were Greek soldiers in their retreat. They had burned other villages in their retreat out of Asia Minor, and this is just their last straw. They were going to burn Smyrna and get on their boat and leave. But that's unfounded, and so we actually have American, not necessarily a biased source for this. As a result, the refugees were caught between the fire and the water. We have, and some of you may know this from family stories, people suffering, being burnt, or in order to avoid being burnt, jumping in the water, perhaps drowning. And so there are accounts even in that story of local boys jumping into the water, local Turkish boys, going to bodies and taking jewelry and kind of swimming. It's a very horrid story. So again, this is a very disturbing account. As a result of all of this, there's said to have been 125,000 Greeks and Armenians that are said to have been killed at this moment. And as a result, and beyond that, there are refugees, over 500,000 refugees, kind of who remain and are trying to find their way out of the city. The Turkish army is supposedly in control, right? But the chaos is beyond even what they can manage. And so, as a result, they put an order out. They say, you have 1 month, and this is to all the Greek Orthodox, 1 month to leave, or they would be forced, especially the men, would be forced into the labor battalions, the Amele Taburu, which essentially is a death battalion, because people that went on those, they would go for work details and they would never come back. Very few people did come back. In fact, one noted, if you're familiar with Greek literature, is Elias Venezis, who is one of, I think, 25 people who survives from his group in that setting. So he writes about his account, what is it? Numero 31, and this is
his prison number.
That's his prisoner number. And so it hasn't been translated into English, which it should be soon, but that's certainly a very dramatic story. His origin is from Ivali, so it's not Smyrna, but the same thing happens a few days later up the coast. I think September 19th is when Ivali is taken over. And so we begin to see, and I'm going to show just some images. In this moment, this 1 month, there was one person who did make a huge difference. An American, he was an administrator of the YMCA. The YMCA was one of these international organizations kind of associated with mission, American mission, but it had an office in Smyrna, and this gentleman named Asa Jennings was the head of it. And as the American consulate had departed, the American government kind of left, he ended up intervening and, in a sense, commandeering ships, kind of merchant ships from Mytilene and some other places in the Greek islands. Japanese also assisted. And there was this massive exodus. The people were, he saved perhaps over 200,000 Greek people. And so this is Asa Jennings. There's a video, I think, based upon him and kind of his biography. He's interesting because, believe it or not, he doesn't leave. He ends up staying as Smyrna is being rebuilt. And he wants to kind of continue the mission of the YMCA, but now it's a totally different landscape. So I'm going to just show a few slides of the burning, and I'm going to be quiet while I show them. This is after the fire. You can see the burnt out building, and people are wondering what their fate will be. And then there are a number of images of scenes of Smyrna. This was a very famous location, a landmark, Hagia Photini, at the bell tower. And you can see here what it was and what it became. And of course, this is prior when there are individuals there were refugees trying to figure out what to do, not refugees, just individuals trying to figure out where to go and how to find salvation somewhere. There's another church of Ayos Ioannis, Geras Horas, which also was kind of rather large on the landscape and destroyed. This church is Evangelistria, and surprisingly it's not as damaged, but mostly from fire, because there are large walls, and it was protected from that. So there's a good reason to have walls. And of course, the individuals fleeing from the docks. So many of us who have kind of connections to Greece and Asia Minor, this is the story of many of your families. My family wasn't part of this in particular, but I think this is, as the consul has said, humanity. This is an issue for all humanity, a universal problem that these people face that we can all relate to. So, the Greeks call this megali katastrophe, the great catastrophe. And I thought, just to kind of share, now, Chrysostomos was, in his own way, very provocative. And some people thought of him as being very much kind of, in fact, the governor, Stergiadis, who had been appointed by Venizelos, had walked into the church during his sermon and said, this is unacceptable, because he was speaking political language and he was supporting this, the Greek army and other things like that. Stergiadis he was a very strict bureaucrat, and he wanted to ensure that, there would be no excesses. And so some people deemed him to be an excessive figure. The Ecumenical Patriarchate in 1993 wrote an encyclical that actually recognizes the Sunday before the exaltation of the Holy Cross in September to commemorate Saint Chrysostomos, Saint Procopius Lazaridis, who is the Metropolitan of Iconium, Saint Gregory, the Metropolitan of Kydonia, which is Ivali, who was killed in October 1922, and then Saint Ephemios, the Metropolitan of Zilon. So they're depicted here in kind of a popular icon, contemporary icon. So to turn to our third statement, third section. The Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Treaty of Lausanne. What would happen to the Patriarchate? In a sense, the overall situation of this Greek-Turkish war had to be solved, and the first step was an armistice, the Armistice of Mudros. And then after that, the great powers decided they should have a full treaty discussion. So they end up going to Switzerland and inviting the parties, including the chief negotiator, Eleftherios Venizelos, and for the Turks, the Ismet Inonu, and they end up discussing what is kind of the solution. A notable figure named Friedrich Nansen is in charge or at least facilitating this, and his idea ends up becoming a prevailing idea leading the way for the solution. He says, in order to have peace in the Middle East, we have to separate the people of the Middle East. Meaning, we can't have ethnicities living amongst each other. Those of us who are here in this country don't abide by that. We don't think about that because we think we are able to live in a common society. Nansen said, we need to create cantons, we need to create separations. And in fact, when it looks to 1991 and the Balkan Wars, the separation of the Serbs and the Bosnians was what the peace treaty from Dayton actually came up with. So the idea is not kind of passé, it still continues. However, for those of us who kind of are seeing it from our vantage point, we think of it as a terrible shame. Right? How can people live amongst each other? So at the peace conference, we have discussions, the signing of the peace accord. This figure is called Reza Noor, and he actually, during this period, has a very staunch idea of what should take place there. The first issue that they tried to deal with was the exchange of population. That's Article 1, or one of the main articles. And Venizelos is also, and there's another picture of him after having signed. Now, I'll say the accomplishments, the results, I should say, of the Treaty of Lausanne. The Treaty of Sèvres, which was much more in favor of Greece, had been replaced. It's at this moment that the Republic of Turkey is fully established, so this is kind of the birthday of that country. It establishes the exchange. So, returning back to Milan, one of the conditions for accepting this, the Ismet Inonu to accept removal of the picture, they wanted Metaxakis out. They wanted to put that condition, say, remove him. So they wished his removal, and Metaxakis, for his part, he's a very interesting personality, and I think a full biography really needs to be written about him. He advocated, for a period, the removal of the Patriarchate to Mount Athos, partly because he thought it would be free of any constraint. Venizelos and many, many other people opposed this idea, and so they actually remain in Istanbul, and eventually, it took him several months. He didn't resign immediately. He was asked to by the treaty, but essentially, he received a telegram from Eleftherios Venizelos, who ultimately said to him, it's time, you need to step down, and ultimately, we're not supporting any of the program. We're accepting the treaty as it has been signed. So Metaxakis, in a sense, had no other choice but to resign. He ended up going to Mount Athos, but then he had another career beyond in Alexandria and other things going on. But he, of course, for those of you who are as familiar, he had been Archbishop in America before he became the Patriarch. Also, he established the Archdiocese in 1922. I should have led with that, but beyond that, so thank you. Now, at the same time, there were a number of Christians who were Greek Orthodox who were Turkish speakers and identified more with their Turkish compatriots, And they found that this was an opportunity to take advantage of the chaos that was ensuing. And so we have the establishment of what's known as the Turkish Orthodox Church by Papa Eftim Karahisaridis, who's a Cappadocian Karamanlida, from the Karamanlidas. And he ends up establishing this. And at one point, after Metaxakis has been kind of removed, they're having an election at the Patriarchate. And he and a few of his comrades end up storming the Patriarchate, taking it over, and trying to disrupt the election. And he told the existing metropolitans that you have no right here, that the state doesn't want you here, and you need to be removed, and we're going to be the legitimate church in Turkey. And of course, this is a conflict right away. What's interesting is that he claimed that the Turkish state had wanted him and his group. In fact, he's surprised when the Turkish government says, we did sign the treaty, these are the rightful authority, and they have their right to remain and to conduct their election of the next patriarch. And so, in a sense, but that doesn't mean that he and his comrades end their story. They end up taking over churches in Pera, Galata, and they end up establishing what's known as the the independent Turkish Orthodox Patriarchate. And so it exists to the present day. I think a great-grandson of this person is technically patriarch, but it's it's not a church, it's not a religious institution in any way. It's just simply a thorn in the side of all the people that are involved in this operation, this situation. I will mention a couple more. There was this controversy as well. The Synod elected Constantine VI. The problem with Constantine VI was, by the terms of the Lausanne Treaty, he was not a resident of Constantinople from the time stipulated. I think it was 1918, I think was the exact time. And so he was deemed an exchangeable population. And so the Turkish government put so much pressure that they ended up forcing him into exile, and this caused a big problem at the time. Now, I wanted just to highlight another aspect, and this is, I think, where we get to, and I'm going to conclude with a couple more comments here. The Republic of Turkey has sought to modernize itself, and they chose the Swiss Civil Code in order to establish their legal system. What they wanted to do by choosing this Swiss Civil Code was to eliminate the religious institutions, and part of their goal was not simply the Patriarchate, they wanted to eliminate the Caliphate. They wanted to get rid of the religious kind of presence of the Caliphate in Istanbul as well, and the Sultan was the Caliph. And so, by bringing the Civil Code, it also did both of those things, or at least that was it. In the process, they also dissolved what we described before, the Permanent Mixed Council of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And this is what they ended up doing. They ended up forcing the Rum community, the Greek Orthodox community, also known as the Rum, to establish a new minority governing board that's not connected to the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and they forced them to hold new elections. This was very controversial, and they went back, and the community went back and forth on this, and they had great debates and fights and discussions, some saying we should just not do that because we'll lose all our connections and rights, and others saying, kind of having been browbeaten and afraid, saying we need to abide by what the Turkish government's telling us. In the process, they forced the community also, very specifically by taking on the Swiss Civil Code, to renounce a very important article from the Treaty of Lausanne. Essentially, by accepting the protection of the Swiss Civil Code, they said that they would reject Article 42 in favor of the protection, or for protection of minority rights. And just I want to identify, this is a very kind of critical feature. It talks about Article 42. The government undertakes, as regards non-Muslims, as concerns their family law, personal status measures permitting the settlement of these questions in accordance with the customs of those minorities. In case of divergence, the Turkish government and the Council of the League of Nations will appoint an agreement, an umpire chosen from among European lawyers. The Turkish government undertakes to grant full protection of the churches, synagogues, cemeteries, and other religious establishments of the above minorities. This is to do that. One step is a leader of the Orthodox for Orthodox unity, as well as pan-Christian and international dialogue. So when I'm talking about the response, it's not just from 1923 to whatever time, it includes our present patriarchate. And in fact, it's in the last 30 years, Patriarch Bartholomew, under his patriarchy, that these have advanced to a degree that were unthinkable 1 century ago. And so by doing that, having this large presence on an international scale, having international dialogues for Christian unity and universal values, and again, focusing on the World Council of Churches for many, many years to bring people together of like mind in order to promote the human values and human rights within what's happening in the Church of Constantinople. This is an interesting one, the international solution to the lack of human capital. As people depart Constantinople, there are fewer people who can work in the patriarchate and institutions. And so I think one of the more important things that has happened in the last, 15 years is the establishment and allowance for individuals to become Turkish citizens and possibly to take positions on the synod and possibly even to become patriarch. So bringing people from the diaspora churches and from other places to work at the patriarchate and to become kind of servants of the church in that way. And then finally, this last one is really...
Let us all, I invite you all to keep our Mother Church in our prayers. We have witnessed in the last 4 hours at least what the history of this church means and how deep it goes and how important is this synergia, this cooperation of laity and clergy. How strong is the ecumenical patriarchate in our Mother Church and our archdiocese here in America having the Archons. So the institution of the Archons is extremely important and goes back to history centuries and centuries. So let us all pray, not now, like now, but always. Whenever we have service, let's pray for the great Church of Christ. And now we know that great Church of Christ is Αγία Σοφία, which is the ecumenical patriarchy. Διευκόν των Αγίων Πατέρων ημών, Κύριε Ιησούς Χριστέ ο Θεός, ελέησον και σώσον ημάς. Αμήν.
Archons to your left.
Кто